The first frost of winter had begun to glaze the forest floor when Ethan, a wildlife photographer, ventured deep into the wilderness. His plan was to capture the raw beauty of the season, but fate had other ideas. As Ethan adjusted his camera near a frozen stream, he heard a sound that cut through the stillness. A high-pitched cry, filled with desperation. Curious and cautious, he followed the sound, his boots crunching through the snow. What he found stopped him in his tracks. A tiny bear cub, no older than a few months, stood trembling at the edge of the stream. Its fur was matted, and its large eyes glistened with fear. The cub cried again, looking directly at Ethan as if pleading for help. Ethan froze. Bears, especially mothers, were fiercely protective of their cubs. He scanned the surroundings, expecting to see the mother nearby, but she was nowhere in sight. Instead, the cub tugged at his pant leg with its tiny paw and then turned, limping toward a dense thicket of trees. "Are you guiding me?" Ethan murmured, incredulous. Against his better judgment, he followed. The cub led him to a heartbreaking sight. A fully grown bear lay trapped beneath a fallen tree. Her leg was pinned, and she was too weak to free herself. She let out a low, pained growl when she saw Ethan, but she lacked the strength to act. The cub nestled against her, nudging her face as if to reassure her. Ethan's heart clenched. Okay, he whispered, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'll help." He assessed the situation. The tree was massive, its weight far beyond what he could lift alone. Thinking quickly, Ethan retrieved a portable saw from his pack, something he always carried in case of emergencies. He worked tirelessly, sawing through the thick trunk, while keeping an eye on the bears. The cub watched him intently, almost as if it understood he was their only hope. After what felt like hours, the log finally split. Ethan used all his strength to push the remaining pieces aside. The mother bear groaned, shifting her leg free. Ethan stepped back quickly, not wanting to test her patience. She sat up slowly, licking her injured paw, and gave Ethan a long, deliberate look, neither threatening nor afraid. The cub, ecstatic, jumped onto its mother, nuzzling her fur. Ethan smiled, his exhaustion replaced with relief. He backed away cautiously, knowing it was time to leave. But before he could, the mother bear surprised him. She rose unsteadily and gave a soft grunt, a sound Ethan interpreted as gratitude. As he hiked back to his campsite, Ethan couldn't help but smile. He had come to the forest seeking beauty and left with something far greater, a connection to the wild and a story of trust and courage he would never forget. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the encounter as he made his way back to his cabin. The look in the mother bear's eyes and the cub's desperate cries lingered in his mind. Despite the satisfaction of helping, he worried about their survival. The mother bear's injured leg would make hunting and foraging nearly impossible in the harsh winter ahead. The next morning, Ethan packed some supplies and ventured back to the spot where he had left the bears. He carried a sturdy first aid kit, fish he had caught earlier in the week, and a few other provisions. He knew it was risky to interfere again, but he couldn't shake the thought that they might not survive without some help. As he approached the clearing, Ethan paused. The cub spotted him first and bounded forward, its tail stub wagging like an excited puppy. Ethan knelt to greet it, chuckling despite himself. "Hey, little guy. Looks like you remember me." The mother bear was resting under a canopy of trees, her injured leg stretched out. She eyed Ethan warily but made no move to attack. The cub's trust seemed to soften her apprehension. Ethan set the fish down at a safe distance and waited. Slowly, the cub nudged one of the fish toward its mother. She sniffed it cautiously, then took a tentative bite. Ethan took the opportunity to inch closer, speaking in a calm, low tone. "I'm here to help. That leg of yours needs tending to." Carefully, he approached with the first aid kit. The bear growled softly but didn't move. Ethan worked quickly, cleaning the wound and applying an antiseptic spray to prevent infection. He wrapped the leg with gauze and bandages, all while the cub stayed close, watching him with its bright, curious eyes. For the next few days, Ethan returned to check on them. He brought food and monitored the mother bear's progress. She began to trust him, allowing him to approach without growling, and the cub grew increasingly playful. One day, it even tugged at the strap of his camera bag, as if urging him to play. Ethan knew, however, that he couldn't stay forever. The bears needed to regain their independence. He decided that his final visit would be to ensure the mother bear could move well enough to care for her cub. On that last day, he arrived to find her standing, testing her injured leg. Though still weak, she seemed stronger, and her eyes had regained their sharpness. The cub ran to him as usual, but this time, the mother bear followed. She stood a few feet away, her massive frame towering over him. Ethan held his breath. Then, to his amazement, she lowered her head slightly, as if acknowledging his help. It was a gesture Ethan would never forget. He left that day with a mix of emotions, pride, relief, and a tinge of sadness. But he also felt a profound connection to the wild, a reminder that compassion could bridge even the most primal divides. Weeks later, as he reviewed the photographs he'd taken during his time in the forest, Ethan found himself smiling at a shot of the cub peeking out from behind a tree. It wasn't just a memory, it was a story of trust, resilience, and the unexpected bonds that nature could create. And he knew that somewhere in the snowy wilderness, a mother bear and her cub were thriving once more. As the weeks passed, Ethan couldn't help but wonder how the mother bear and her cub were faring. He often found himself staring out the cabin window, imagining them navigating the forest, the cub growing stronger under its mother's care. Winter deepened, cloaking the landscape in a blanket of snow, and though Ethan tried to focus on his photography, his thoughts frequently drifted back to the pair. One morning, just as dawn broke, Ethan heard a soft rustling outside his cabin. He froze, his breath catching in the crisp air. Slowly, he moved to the window and peered out. There they were. The mother bear stood at the edge of the clearing, her powerful form dusted with snow. Her injured leg had healed significantly, her movements more confident. Beside her, the cub bounded through the snow, playful and exuberant. Ethan could hardly believe his eyes. Why had they returned? Grabbing his coat, Ethan stepped outside cautiously. The cub ran toward him without hesitation, circling his legs and letting out small, excited huffs. Ethan chuckled, kneeling to greet it. The mother bear watched from a distance, her gaze calm and steady. She didn't growl or show any signs of hostility. Instead, she sat back on her haunches, almost as if she had come to deliver a message. "You're okay," Ethan said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. "You're really okay." The cub, ever curious, tugged at Ethan's glove with its teeth, as if urging him to follow. He glanced at the mother bear, who gave a low grunt and turned, starting to walk toward the trees. The cub dashed ahead, pausing to look back at Ethan, clearly waiting for him. Intrigued, Ethan grabbed his gear and followed them into the forest. They led him through a maze of snow-laden trees, past frozen streams and hidden clearings. The journey felt surreal, as though he were part of something ancient and unspoken. Finally, they stopped at the base of a towering cedar tree. Ethan's breath caught. At the foot of the tree was a den, its entrance partially hidden by overhanging branches. The mother bear nudged the cub inside before turning to face Ethan one last time. She let out a deep, resonant huff, a sound that seemed to echo with gratitude. Ethan stood motionless, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "You brought me here to show me you're safe," he whispered. "That you're home." The mother bear lingered a moment longer, then disappeared into the den after her cub. Ethan stayed for a while, his heart full, before making his way back to the cabin. That winter, Ethan's photographs told a different story than usual. Instead of focusing on landscapes, they captured the quiet, profound moments of connection he'd experienced. He published his work in a photo essay titled "The Cry of the Wild," sharing the story of the bear cub who begged for help and the mother who taught him about resilience and trust. The essay went viral, touching hearts around the world. People were inspired by Ethan's journey and the bond he'd formed with the wild creatures. Conservation groups reached out, asking him to collaborate on efforts to protect habitats for bears and other wildlife. But for Ethan, the greatest reward wasn't the recognition or the impact of his story. It was knowing that somewhere deep in the wilderness, a bear and her cub thrived because, for a moment, a human had dared to bridge the gap between their worlds. Spring came, melting the snow and breathing new life into the forest. With the thaw, Ethan found himself pulled back into the rhythm of nature. His work with conservation groups had grown, and he frequently ventured into the wilderness to document its fragile beauty. Yet, in the back of his mind, he often wondered if he'd ever see the mother bear and her cub again. He didn't have to wait long for an answer. One late afternoon, while setting up his camera near a blooming meadow, Ethan heard the familiar rustling of leaves. His heart leaped, and he turned slowly. Emerging from the tree line were the bear and her cub. But the cub was no longer small and fragile, it had grown significantly, its fur thick and shiny, its steps confident. The sight filled Ethan with a mixture of pride and amazement. He remained still, letting them approach on their terms. The cub recognized him immediately, bounding forward with the same playful enthusiasm as before. It circled him, sniffing his boots and tugging at his camera strap, as if greeting an old friend. The mother bear followed at a slower pace, her eyes calm and familiar. Ethan smiled. "You're back." This time, there was no injury to tend to, no desperate plea for help. Instead, the bears seemed to be visiting simply to reconnect. The cub pawed at Ethan's bag, nosing through his supplies until it found a packet of dried berries. Ethan laughed, opening it and laying the berries out on a flat rock. The cub nibbled happily while the mother bear watched, her body relaxed. Ethan took out his camera, capturing the moment. He didn't just see animals in front of him, he saw a story of survival, trust, and an unspoken bond. The bears lingered with him in the meadow for hours. The cub played in the tall grass, rolling and tumbling, while the mother bear grazed and rested nearby. Ethan took his time observing them, marveling at their resilience. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the mother bear stood and gave a low grunt. The cub obediently scampered back to her side. Ethan knew this was goodbye. "Take care of each other," he said softly, watching as they disappeared into the forest. He stood there for a long time after they were gone, the meadow silent except for the rustle of leaves in the wind. From that day on, Ethan's connection to the wilderness deepened. He dedicated his life not only to photographing wildlife but also to protecting it. His story of the bear and her cub inspired countless people, sparking a wave of support for conservation efforts. Ethan often wondered if the bears would return again someday, but even if they didn't, he knew they were thriving. And somewhere deep in the wild, under the shade of ancient trees, a mother bear and her now-grown cub roamed free, forever linked to the man who had answered their cry for help. Years passed, and Ethan's life became a mosaic of adventures in the wilderness. His work had taken him to landscapes far and wide, but the memory of the mother bear and her cub always stayed with him. Their story became the cornerstone of his advocacy efforts, featured in books, documentaries, and lectures that inspired thousands to care for the natural world. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan found himself back in the forest where it all began. The air was filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and golden sunlight filtered through the canopy. Something about the day felt special, though he couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the familiarity of the forest or the nostalgia of walking the same paths where he had first encountered the bears. As he rounded a bend near the meadow, Ethan stopped in his tracks. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a large bear, majestic, with a thick coat that glistened in the sunlight. It took him a moment to recognize her. It was the mother bear, older but unmistakably the same. Her movements were steady and confident, her gaze piercing yet calm. Ethan's heart swelled. "It's you," he whispered, almost afraid to break the spell. Then, from behind her, another figure emerged, not the cub he once knew, but a fully grown bear. The cub had matured into a strong, healthy adult, its presence every bit as commanding as its mother's. Yet, there was a playful light in its eyes that Ethan recognized instantly. The sight filled him with awe. Not only had they survived, but they had flourished. The years had been kind to them, and now, they stood before him, a testament to resilience and the profound connection they had shared. Ethan remained still, letting them come closer. The younger bear, now as large as its mother, approached first. It sniffed the air around Ethan, then gave a low, rumbling sound, a friendly greeting, Ethan liked to think. The mother bear stayed back, watching with an almost regal demeanor. For a while, they simply existed together in the meadow. Ethan didn't take out his camera this time. Instead, he sat on a fallen log, content to simply be present. The younger bear pawed at the ground, occasionally glancing at him, as if to say, "Remember me?" The mother bear grazed calmly, her trust in Ethan unwavering. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the meadow, the bears began to move toward the forest. The younger bear lingered, looking back at Ethan one last time before following its mother into the trees. Ethan sat there long after they were gone, the quiet of the forest wrapping around him like a warm embrace. He felt a profound sense of peace, knowing he had been part of something extraordinary, a rare and beautiful bond that transcended species and time. When he finally rose to leave, Ethan carried with him not just memories but a renewed purpose. The bears had shown him the importance of every action, no matter how small, in preserving the delicate balance of life. And as he walked back through the forest, he made a silent promise to continue protecting the wild so that moments like these could happen, not just for him, but for generations to come. The story of the bear and her cub became a legend among those who knew Ethan's work, a tale of trust, hope, and the enduring power of kindness. And though the bears faded back into the wilderness, their legacy remained, woven into the fabric of the forest and the heart of the man who had once saved them.